In the heart of a manicured suburban neighborhood, where every lawn was trimmed to perfection and driveways gleamed under the golden afternoon sun, the name of one woman was whispered in both awe and envy: Victoria Harrow. She was the HOA president, a role she wielded not with subtlety, but as a crown, a symbol of her self-perceived authority. Every morning, she emerged from her sprawling mansion as though stepping onto a stage, her luxury cars glinting in the driveway, each one meticulously polished to a mirror shine. Neighbors watched, some with admiration, many with quiet resentment as she passed by, nodding imperiously, as if the neighborhood were her private court. Her mansion was legendary. White marble steps led to a double-door entrance framed by ornate columns, and every window reflected sunlight as if demanding attention. From the outside, it seemed untouchable, a palace befitting someone whose tastes defined the standards of the community. Victoria didn't just live in the mansion, she performed within it. The garden parties, the rooftop cocktail events, the charity galas she hosted. They were spectacles, carefully curated to broadcast her influence. Social media posts captured it all: chandeliers, flowing gowns, sparkling wine, and luxury cars parked in neat lines. Every picture, every post, reinforced the image of a woman whose wealth was unmatched. But beneath the glittering exterior, subtle signs hinted that Victoria's empire might not be entirely built on her own fortune. Staff members moved with a quiet urgency, answering to her with practiced politeness that bordered on fear. Some neighbors had noticed oddities: utility bills that seemed too low for such a mansion, employees who treated her with the reverence usually reserved for someone of extreme wealth, and fleeting glimpses of delivery trucks arriving with brands that weren't commonly available to the public. Yet no one dared question her openly. The HOA meetings she chaired were exercises in spectacle as well. Victoria had a presence that could command a room, and she wielded it effortlessly. Complaints about minor infractions, like a garden gnome, slightly out of alignment, or a mailbox that didn't meet her aesthetic standards, were treated as high crimes. Her power seemed absolute, and the neighbors, who once might have whispered resistance, had grown wary. Some would later admit that her control was intoxicating, a blend of fear, fascination, and the seductive pull of someone who seemed untouchable. As the months passed, Victoria continued to fortify her image. She threw parties that seemed almost mythic in scale: string quartets in the garden, champagne fountains, valet services, and luxury cars lining her driveway like a parade of status symbols. Each event was an opportunity for her to reinforce her position, ensuring that neighbors associated her name with glamour, influence, and wealth. Rumors began circulating about the source of her fortune. Some claimed she inherited a vast estate. Others whispered about secret business ventures, but nothing was ever confirmed. The ambiguity only made her more captivating. Then, one quiet evening, a storm began to stir beneath the polished surface of Victoria's empire. A new neighbor, someone quietly observant, had begun noticing discrepancies, tiny inconsistencies, in the way the mansion was maintained, the subtle over-reliance on staff, the frequent visits of a man who was never officially part of the household but seemed to manage transactions, deliveries, and staff directives with authority. Little by little, he became a shadow behind Victoria's shining image, someone whose presence seemed both pivotal and oddly commanding. This neighbor, intrigued and cautious, began piecing together the threads of what didn't add up. For months, they observed without confronting, cataloging patterns that told a story hidden beneath the surface of the mansion's opulence. Victoria continued her performances, oblivious or perhaps confident that no one could see through the veil she had so carefully woven. Yet, as the pieces began to form a clearer picture, an undercurrent of tension built among those who watched. The veneer of absolute control began to seem slightly less solid. It was during one of Victoria's most extravagant gatherings, a gala that illuminated the entire block with lights and music, that the first cracks in her image became impossible to ignore. The mysterious man appeared frequently, almost shadow-like, directing staff and coordinating deliveries. Guests whispered among themselves, noting that he seemed to command more influence over the operations than Victoria herself. Her smile remained practiced, but it faltered in moments when she needed to assert control. The spectacle continued, but those who were paying attention began to sense that the illusion of power might be exactly that, an illusion. By the end of the evening, the murmurs had grown louder. A few neighbors compared notes, connecting details that had seemed minor before. Unexplained deliveries, strange patterns of payment, the absence of any confirmed source of Victoria's wealth. A pattern began emerging that no one had openly articulated before. The mansion, the cars, the parties, all of it seemed to rely on resources that Victoria herself didn't fully control. The whispers in the neighborhood began to shift from admiration and fear to curiosity, suspicion, and the faint stirrings of outrage. As the night drew to a close, the mansion stood illuminated against the darkness, a beacon of wealth and glamour. But behind the sparkling facade, a truth hovered, unspoken and powerful. The story of Victoria Harrow, of the HOA president whose image of opulence had defined the neighborhood, was far from complete. The pieces were in place, the questions were forming, and soon the neighborhood would discover that the crown she wore so proudly might not have been hers to begin with. And so the first crack in Victoria's carefully constructed empire had appeared. Beneath the glitter, the mansion was a stage, and the true story, hidden from public view, was about to begin unraveling. The days following Victoria's glittering gala were filled with hushed conversations and cautious observations. The neighborhood had begun to stir with an unusual energy, a mixture of curiosity, doubt, and the faint thrill of scandal. People who had once accepted her dominance without question now noticed the subtle inconsistencies that had long been overlooked. The mansion, with its sprawling marble steps and immaculate gardens, no longer seemed untouchable. Instead, it felt like a carefully constructed illusion, and the questions began to multiply. The mysterious man who had appeared during the gala became the focal point of these suspicions. Neighbors began to notice him more frequently, moving through the mansion with a quiet authority that rivaled Victoria's own. He coordinated deliveries, oversaw the staff, and even seemed to dictate the schedule for social events. To those observing from the edges of the driveway or across the street, it became clear that Victoria, for all her poise and control, was not the sole orchestrator of the empire she projected. Behind the mansion's grand doors, the truth of her fortune was slowly coming into focus. The man, known to the staff as Mr. Kessler, handled financial matters with meticulous precision. Payments for the mansion's upkeep, for the luxury cars, and for the lavish events were made in ways that defied conventional logic. They flowed from accounts and sources that were not linked to Victoria herself, and yet she lived as though they were her own. It was a revelation that, when quietly shared among the observant neighbors, sent ripples of disbelief through the community. Victoria's lifestyle, once envied and feared, began to seem less glamorous and more strategic. Every expensive car parked along the driveway, every champagne fountain at her events, every staff member who hovered obediently at her command. It was part of a carefully curated image funded by someone else's resources. The realization was intoxicating to those who watched from a distance. The queen of the HOA was not the architect of her own kingdom, and yet she had ruled it with the confidence of a true monarch. The whispers intensified when a small group of neighbors, emboldened by curiosity, began piecing together the history of Victoria's rise. They discovered that the mansion had been purchased under a business entity they had never heard of, and that the financing came from a network of investors and backers, all of whom seemed to operate behind the scenes. While Victoria hosted parties and charity events, the real decision-makers remained in the shadows. It became apparent that the entire image of power, wealth, and influence was built on a foundation she did not control. Despite these revelations, Victoria's public persona remained flawless. She continued to appear at HOA meetings with the same commanding presence, issuing directives, correcting minor infractions, and enforcing the neighborhood's meticulously curated standards. Her social media remained a showcase of glamour. Cocktails glinting in crystal glasses, gardens bathed in sunset light, luxury cars gleaming under the California sun. Yet the cracks were widening. Even the most loyal neighbors could not ignore the growing evidence that her wealth and authority were not entirely her own. The tension within the neighborhood reached a quiet fever pitch. Small incidents, like the sudden absence of a luxury car at a gathering or the delay of an extravagant delivery, prompted speculation and scrutiny. Observant neighbors began tracking the comings and goings of the mysterious Mr. Kessler, noting that his influence extended far beyond what Victoria herself could claim. His presence suggested a hidden network of control, one that was patient, deliberate, and entirely opaque to outsiders. As the truth slowly surfaced, the social dynamics of the HOA began to shift. Former admirers began to question their deference, realizing that their awe had been directed at an image rather than a reality. Meanwhile, Victoria, unaware of the subtle scrutiny building around her, continued to act with the confidence of someone untouchable. She hosted her events with the same flair, flaunted her possessions with the same pride, and enforced HOA regulations with unwavering intensity. It was a performance refined over years, and she believed it would remain unchallenged. Yet the tension reached a boiling point when a neighbor, emboldened by months of observation, decided to investigate more directly. They traced the mansion's financial trail through public records, business filings, and the occasional inadvertent hint from staff members. Slowly, an irrefutable picture began to emerge. The mansion, the cars, the events, all of it was funded, maintained, and orchestrated by a web of investors, donors, and a single unseen figure whose authority eclipsed Victoria's public persona. The glamorous image she projected was nothing more than a mask, and the neighborhood was on the cusp of realizing it. The revelation cast a long shadow over Victoria's empire. Where once there had been admiration, now there was a sense of betrayal, curiosity, and intrigue. Neighbors began to watch more closely, noting small details in her behavior that hinted at unease, an abrupt hesitation, a fleeting expression of worry, a staff member who lingered a moment too long in her absence. The illusion of control, so carefully maintained, was beginning to falter. It was during another grand event, this time a charity fundraiser that lit the mansion in dazzling lights, that the first undeniable evidence of the hidden hand emerged. A document was inadvertently revealed, showing the flow of funds from accounts bearing the name of a powerful investor directly into the mansion's upkeep and event planning. Those few who saw it immediately understood the implications. Victoria's entire public image of wealth was sustained not by her own fortune, but by someone else's generosity or manipulation. The quiet observers who had pieced together the truth realized that the neighborhood's queen was not quite what she seemed. The mansion, once a symbol of her power, now felt like a stage, with Victoria herself as the lead performer in a play she did not fully control. And yet, she remained unaware that her carefully curated image was starting to unravel, that the admiration and fear she commanded were slowly being replaced by suspicion and fascination with the real story behind the luxury. The first cracks in her authority were no longer subtle. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted from whispers of awe to pointed speculation. Everyone wanted to know whose money had built this empire, who was really pulling the strings behind the mansion, and most importantly, how long could Victoria continue the performance before the truth came fully into the light. As the night drew to a close, The mansion sparkled in the darkness, its lights shimmering like a beacon of opulence. But behind the grand facade, the truth waited patiently, ready to emerge, ready to redefine the neighborhood's understanding of power, wealth, and influence. Victoria's reign, built on illusion as much as reality, was on the brink of exposure. The neighborhood had entered a new rhythm, one defined by quiet observation, whispered speculation, and the undercurrent of an impending revelation. Victoria. Harrow's mansion, once the unassailable symbol of her power and glamour, now drew attention for reasons beyond admiration. The story that had simmered beneath the surface for months was poised to erupt, and the residents of the community were ready, eager even, to witness the unraveling of the illusion they had once revered. The first signs of change were subtle. Staff members, long accustomed to the practiced authority of Victoria, began to shift their loyalties toward Mr. Kessler, the shadowy figure who had orchestrated the mansion's operations from behind the scenes. He moved with quiet efficiency, overseeing deliveries, payments, and events, while Victoria remained the public face of authority. At first, the neighborhood did not notice. Her carefully maintained image still commanded attention at HOA meetings, social gatherings, and charity events. But cracks had begun to show, hesitations in her speech, a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, and a sense that she was increasingly responding to forces outside her control. Then came the subtle but undeniable signs of her dependence. Luxury cars, once parked in neat formation, began arriving late. Party preparations were occasionally incomplete, and small oversights, impossible in Victoria's previous reign of perfection, became noticeable. The neighbors, who had once watched in awe, now began to whisper, sharing observations with one another. It was not long before someone discovered financial records confirming what many had suspected. The mansion, the cars, the lavish parties, everything was financed by Mr. Kessler and a network of investors, not Victoria herself. The revelation spread quietly at first, then like wildfire. Social media posts, once filled with admiration and envy, now carried the undercurrent of scandal. Photos of Victoria at gala events, once symbols of her influence, were now seen as images of a carefully curated performance. Commentary exploded. Across HOA forums and community message boards, questions, rumors, and theories about the true source of her wealth dominated discussions. Victoria's carefully constructed persona, which had commanded respect and fear, began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. Victoria herself remained outwardly composed, but her control was slipping. She continued to attend HOA meetings, but her words rang with less authority. Staff members hesitated when following her directives, and neighbors noticed subtle signs of tension between her and Mr. Kessler. He moved with quiet confidence, managing the operations that Victoria had once showcased as her own brilliance. It was an invisible coup, a shifting of power that left Victoria as the face of the mansion while the real authority operated behind the scenes. The turning point came during one of her largest social events, a gala meant to cement her position as the unchallenged queen of the neighborhood. The mansion was illuminated with thousands of lights, and the guests arrived in their finest attire. Yet, amid the glittering displays of opulence, whispers began circulating. Guests noticed the subtle cues. Mr. Kessler directing staff, orchestrating deliveries, and subtly managing Victoria herself. The illusion of control, once absolute, was now visibly fractured. Observers could see that the empire she had claimed as her own was, in reality, sustained entirely by someone else's resources. By the end of the evening, the truth could no longer be contained. Neighbors began piecing together the full story, connecting months of observations, financial traces, and behind-the-scenes behavior. The image of Victoria as the untouchable HOA queen evaporated under the weight of evidence. She had built her influence and image on the wealth and orchestration of others, and the neighborhood finally recognized the extent of the illusion. The mansion, the parties, the luxury, none of it truly belonged to her. The fallout was swift. Conversations at HOA meetings shifted from compliance and fear to scrutiny and exposure. Victoria, once the unchallenged authority, now faced questions and doubts that she could not simply dismiss. Her social media presence, previously a tool of influence, became a battleground for rumors and revelation. Even her most loyal supporters struggled to reconcile the image they had admired with the reality that had now been exposed. Yet there was a strange resilience to Victoria. Even as the truth came to light, she continued to inhabit the mansion, to host events, and to maintain a public persona of control. But those who observed her closely could see the subtle changes, the tension in her posture, the reliance on Mr. Kessler, and the way she now navigated the neighborhood with a careful awareness that her authority was no longer unquestioned. The fall of the HOA queen was not violent, dramatic, or public in a single moment. It was a slow, creeping realization, a quiet dismantling of an image built over years. The neighborhood in the aftermath became a community of spectators, witnesses to the unraveling of a carefully constructed empire. Conversations shifted from admiration to analysis, and the story of Victoria Harrow became a cautionary tale. Appearances could deceive, authority could be an illusion, and even the most commanding figures might owe their power to forces unseen. The mansion, once the symbol of her dominance, now stood as a stage upon which the truth had been revealed, a reminder that wealth, influence, and authority are rarely as simple as they appear. In the end, Victoria continued to inhabit her mansion, surrounded by the trappings of luxury she did not fully own, performing the role she had perfected over years. But the neighborhood had seen behind the curtain, and the reality was undeniable. The HOA queen was not the architect of her own empire. The mansion, the parties, the luxury, it was all orchestrated by others, and the revelation had shifted the balance of power, respect, and perception forever. The story of Victoria Harrow, the HOA president whose mansion wasn't truly hers, became a legend in the neighborhood. It was told in whispers, online forums, and casual conversations at block parties. The glittering image of power, once absolute, was now a lesson in illusion, control, and the hidden forces that often shape what we believe to be reality. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, the mansion glimmered in the evening light, a beautiful facade with a secret that everyone now knew.